In the American legal system, a ghost exists within the written text of the law. It is a doctrine created not by Congress, but by the highest court's own hand. To understand the shield, one must return to the heat of Jackson, Mississippi, 1961.
15 men arrived at a terminal, carrying only their faith and the written Constitution. They were ministers of the church, stepping into a space where their presence was illegal. The law at the time demanded a separation that the federal courts had already rejected. Yet local enforcement remained committed to a social order that was rapidly failing and dying. The sign was a command, an unconstitutional relic enforced by the power of the state.
The officers approached not with violence, but with the quiet authority of local legal code.
Every action taken that afternoon was documented with the cold precision of a formal report.
The tension was silent, held between the men in collars and the men in blue. They were told to move, but the men remained in their seats, invoking a higher law.
The geography of the room determined the legality of their presence under the local statutes.
The arrest was the beginning of a legal journey that would take 7 long years.
The community watched as their leaders were led away into the back of a van. The human cost of a legal challenge is often measured in years of quiet uncertainty. Families waited for news, while the mechanisms of the state began to turn against them. For the 15 ministers, the arrest was not a crime, but a necessary moral testimony. The stakes were higher than a simple fine. They were challenging the core of authority. The neighborhood fell silent as the legal implications of the protest began to settle in. The public record began to frame the men either as heroes or as dangerous agitators. The emotional weight of the struggle was often carried in silence behind closed domestic doors. Life continued in Jackson, even as the foundation of its legal code was being shaken. The men prepared for court with the same dignity they brought to the bus station.
Their voices would soon be recorded for the official record of the Mississippi courts. The struggle for civil rights was moving from the streets into the sterile courtroom atmosphere. Support gathered in the shadows of the church, far from the eyes of the law.
The ministers knew that the law was a machine, and they were the subjects. The formal charges were typed out on thick, white paper with carbon copy backing. The prosecution's case was built on the violation of a specific breach of peace. Each minister was processed, their identities becoming numbers in the local jail system's records. The physical marks of the arrest were permanent, documented in ink on cardstock files. Detention was a temporary state, but the legal pursuit would last for many years.
The initial questioning was methodical, focused on the intent behind the minister's quiet refusal.
Every word spoken was a potential trap in the unfolding legal chess match of 1961.
The defense began to look for precedents that could shield the men from conviction.
The testimony was captured on magnetic tape.
The atmosphere in the precinct, was one of bureaucratic indifference to the unfolding crisis. The transition from the bus station to the cell was a calculated state action. Even their clothing was itemized, treated as evidence of their status as organized protesters. The initial pursuit was over, but the legal machinery had only just begun moving. The record of the arrest was sealed, ready for the first round of trials. Investigators looked for signs of a crowd that did not exist in reality. The law was being used as a flexible tool to justify the initial arrest. Forensic details were secondary to the political necessity of the minister's successful criminal conviction. The physical space of the bus station was mapped with an obsessive, technical accuracy. The concept of protecting officials was a dormant seed in the 1961 legal code. The case file grew, becoming a physical manifestation of the state's massive legal power. Every document produced was a layer in the wall being built around the defendants. The evidence was curated to present a narrative of chaos that never actually happened. The geography of the case was as important as the individuals who were involved.
The statute used for the arrest was designed to be broad and easily applied.
The flaws in the evidence began to emerge under the pressure of the defense. The search for truth was buried under thousands of pages of bureaucratic legal filings. The validity of the arrest was the central question of the entire forensic analysis. The evidence was complete, but the interpretation of it belonged to the court system. The trial began in a room that smelled of old wax and heavy air. The judge presided over a case that would eventually reach the highest court. The testimony was a clash of two very different versions of the same reality. The tension in the room was physical, a weight shared by everyone in attendance. The trial dragged on through the heat of the Mississippi afternoon sun. The defense argued that the ministers were protected by the First Amendment's rights.
Every argument was converted into a series of symbols on a paper strip.
The first round of the legal battle ended with a predictable local conviction. The conviction was only the first step in a much larger legal strategy. The record of the trial was sent upward to the higher appellate courts. The courtroom emptied, leaving the case to be decided by the higher judges.
The battle shifted from the facts of the arrest to the theory of law.
The jury's decision was local, but the implications were beginning to turn national.
The first chapter of the battle was closed, but the war was starting.
The court introduced a new defense based on the officer's subjective intent. The shield was being forged out of the need to protect state officials. The systemic flaw was a deliberate choice to prioritize order over civil rights.
The concept of immunity was being expanded to cover almost all police actions. The machinery of the law was being lubricated to protect the status quo.
The law was redefined to allow for reasonable mistakes by the local officers.
The balance of power was shifting away from the citizen and toward the state.
The local error was now a national precedent that would affect every state.
The decision was made in private, but the consequences would be very public.
Justice was becoming a matter of procedural luck and specific judicial interpretation. The systemic flaw of 1967 was now the law of the entire land.
The final appeal reached the highest court in the spring of 1967.
The setting was monumental, but the question was one of very basic rights. The ruling was a compromise that tried to balance two incompatible legal ideas.
The resolution was long, taking 6 years to reach this final, quiet room.
The world outside had changed since the ministers were arrested in 1961.
The finality of the ruling was absolute, binding all lower courts to follow.
The public reaction was mixed, buried under the other news of the 60s.
The justices went home, leaving the new doctrine to begin its long life.
The 1967 ruling was a permanent anchor in the ship of the state.
Time would prove that the shield was more powerful than the court imagined.
The ministers returned to their lives, their legal battle finally at an end.
The journey was over for the men, but the precedent was just starting.
The site of the original paradox was now just a quiet, empty space.
Today, the shield of 1967 is more prominent in the courts than ever. The doctrine has evolved into a nearly insurmountable barrier for most modern plaintiffs.
The systemic flaw remains a foundational part of the modern American justice system.
Thousands of cases now rely on the precedent set by those 15 ministers.
The language of good faith has been replaced by clearly established law.
The core of the 1967 ruling is still the heart of the law. The distance between the 1961 arrest and modern law is shorter than expected. The institution remembers its own history through the permanence of its written rules.
The shield remains, protecting the system from the costs of its own errors.
Accountability is often the sacrifice made at the altar of institutional stability today.
The daily paradox is that the law can be both right and wrong.
One small ruling in 1967 changed the lives of millions of American citizens.
The case is closed, but the paradox of the shield is never finished.
The shield remains, a permanent fixture in a system that values stability over accountability.